Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Method Space, and I'm pleased to be joined here today by my colleague, Linda Bloomberg. We're going to talk about managing and writing your doctoral thesis or dissertation. But before we get started, if you are new to Method Space, this is a blog sponsored by Sage Publishing that focuses on all aspects of research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram is teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. So, Linda, why don't you begin by introducing yourself?
Okay. Hi. Thanks so much, Janet. And thank you to Method Space for having me again. I'm really happy to talk about the 5th edition of my book, which actually was published today, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a Roadmap from Beginning to End, and to talk about some of the organizational and writing tasks involved in completing a doctoral dissertation or thesis. So looking forward to having your questions and trying to be as explicit as possible, and also sharing parts of the book that pertain to research and writing skills. Also, just to introduce myself, I am a full professor at National University, and I've worked in the online environment and higher education for almost 2 decades now, working with doctoral students, mostly qualitative research students, and that's my passion. So thanks so much for having me.
So, well, as you mentioned, your book is written particularly, about qualitative dissertation. The things we're talking about here today, really apply to, anyone who is writing their big piece of doctoral work, whether that's called a thesis or a dissertation in your universe. So, one of the things that I also worked with a lot of doctoral students and could see the places where things bogged down. So those are some of the kinds of topics that I've brought forward to discuss with you. So first, thinking about that big piece of work, it's maybe one of the largest projects that most people ever do. It's a major multi-year project. And many people get overwhelmed just by the number of details they need to keep track of through this process and to continue to develop it through multiple versions, etc. What organizational or project skills should researchers develop in order to manage this process?
That's really a great question. And that really is the topic of chapter 2 of my book, where I talk about the methods for engaging in an organized project management initiative. And as we know, a dissertation can be a multi-year, very complex, and usually iterative and messy project. And so organizational skills are really important right from the very beginning. And I talk about that in detail. I think one of the things to help novice researchers not feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the project is to really understand it as a step-by-step process where we chunk our time based on the tasks that we have to complete and move ahead in that sort of like step-by-step fashion so that we can actually accomplish this huge project and not get bogged down by it or even give it up along the way. As you know, many students do not manage to complete a dissertation simply because it is so complex. And that's what we want to really try and avoid with our students, is to help them move toward a successful completion. And so I think that organizing and managing a project starts with being very proactive in terms of creating a workspace for your dissertation. And by that, I mean a physical as well as a mental or intellectual space. So for students who are starting off in the process, you can work smart by creating those spaces for yourself, both physically and also mind-wise. So physically, I would say that creating a dedicated to dissertation workspace means finding somewhere that you feel peaceful and comfortable in working. That could be at home, it could be in a coffee shop, it could be in your workplace, but somewhere that you feel you can retreat to and actually start working on your dissertation in that dedicated to dissertation space. aside with the physical space, I think that mental space, that intellectual space, is to try and conceptualize the process as something that you do need to set aside from your regular life. So to sort of conceptualize that, what is going to be my dissertation space? Is it going to be something that I attend to on a daily basis? Is it something that I would work on maybe every second day, weekly, or whatever? So trying to wrap your head around what your commitments are in your personal and professional life, and then identifying the most suitable times that you can dedicate to writing your dissertation. I think that giving yourself those two spaces, the physical and intellectual, is a great first start in managing your project. Next, I would say that identifying writing resources is really important. And that means, where is your library? What library will you be using, or libraries? What sort of online resources do you have available to you? What programs do you have available to you? What is your connectivity like, your internet situation? Do you have the right hardware? Is your computer set up for the processes that you will need to be doing, based on your research necessities? And then also managing the data, because as you begin to collect information, you need to create what I call a dissertation research toolbox, where you start collecting all the different data that you may need and all the different resources that you may need, including documents, correspondence, photocopies, pieces of reflective writing, class notes, reading notes, discussion notes, field notes, and all of those sort of things. So that data collection process is really important, and how you store it. Is it going to be the old-fashioned, which is still a good way of doing it, which is the hard copy way of printing out information and storing it in folders? Is it going to be electronic and stored on your computer? All of those sort of decisions you should think about as you start getting ready and gearing up for this multi-year project. I also always recommend to students to keep the various drafts of their dissertation or thesis, because you may want to go back in time to previous drafts and see how you had written something or identified something or changed something even. And so I would always say, save everything in very well documented folders on your computer, so that you can go back to dated document, and also keeping the dates attached. You can go back in time and see how you have progressed or how you changed over time, which is often very, very important, especially with a dissertation where we are expected to keep an audit trail of our thinking. And so talking about that audit trail, another great resource and another great strategy is to journal. To have a journal where you're actually journaling the different changes that you're encountering, the different factors that you're reflecting on. And again, having that all down noted with dates helps you keep that audit trail of your process if you're ever asked about it, either in the defense, which is the oral defense, or even in your write-up, in your findings and conclusions and recommendations. So another thing is vigilance in saving. It's all very well to save all of this data, but really be sure to back it up as well, because we all know that computers can crash. And the last thing that anybody wants is to lose information, especially when you're involved in such an intense and complex project. So save everything, be vigilant, save to an external hard drive, save to the cloud. Whatever works best for you and what you're comfortable with is really, really important, because, data security and data confidentiality these days is also a huge concern. And so you want to be sure that all your data is safely stored and securely stored. I also just want to go back to what I said initially about planning, your intellectual space, your head space for this, is being very, very careful about how you're going to plan your time, because none of us have a crystal ball where we know where we're going to be next month or next year or in 2 years' time. But we should have some idea in our mind about how long we want to spend on this project and how much time we want to actually contribute to it on an ongoing basis until we've completed. So developing a timeline, a realistic timeline, so to say, is really, really important. And actually, I talk about that in my book, and it's one of the charts that will be shared on the Sage Method Space site, is what I call a schedule planning tool, where you can actually start scheduling out your time based on the time that you have available, the facilities that you have available, and the frequency at which you want to work over time in your dissertation endeavor. So that schedule planning tool would be really, really useful. Also, be really realistic about your timeline, because it's all very well to say, you know, I want this finished in a year, but that may not be realistic given your personal and professional commitments. So try and be realistic in terms of what else you have going on in your life and how much time you can actually devote to this. Because remember, in this intensive process, your dissertation committee also have deadlines and also have timeframes and certain basis of availability. So they may not be able to meet with you every week or every day, and they may only have certain office hours. So you also have to go according to your committee, especially your dissertation chair's timeline and their availability and expectations for you. I'm just trying to think what else I find really important, but really one of the things that, as I said in the beginning, is to really chunk the tasks. So really see this dissertation as biting off one chunk of the elephant at a time. You cannot conquer it all together. So a useful guiding principle is to take it one step at a time, but also being careful to always be one step ahead of the curve by having a sense of your next step. So be sure about what you want to accomplish, and in the back of your mind, have a clear idea of what's going to come afterwards.
Right.
And so that takes a lot of reflection. And one final thing I just want to say about that setting up process and getting your, you know, all your ducks in a row, so to speak, is also to become very, very familiar with your institution's IRB, Institutional Review Board, because that is often a stumbling block in many research projects, simply because the IRB has certain regulations and expectations and requirements that are mandated. And so you don't want to reach that stage in the process and be surprised. So right from the very beginning, take a look at your institution's IRB requirements, expectations, attend workshops if needed, know about all the different forms that you're going to have to submit for your project, for your study. In those forms, you're going to have to be very clear and transparent about how you intend to address all the different requirements. But I think forearmed is forewarned. And so being really careful about knowing what is coming down the line, and the IRB being one of them, is a really important suggestion. And finally, I just want to say, and I also write about this in my book, is that in following up with many of my students regarding their progress, I often hear them saying, I'm still reading. And reading is excellent. And reading is a huge part of doing research. But remember, you have to start writing. And until you start writing, you're not going to be able to move your process forward. So adopt from the very beginning a very proactive approach and a do-it-now mindset, and actually get started. Get started on your journaling, get started on your organization, get started in identifying what your resources are, what your dissertation committee is requiring, what the IRB is requiring. And as soon as you've got that down, you're in a great position to actually get started.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree with your suggestion, having a sense of what the entire project is going to entail, and, you know, being able to, you know, kind of think a step ahead. But, you know, and I want to just emphasize, you know, some of the things that you've said, you know, in terms of deciding on what system you are going to use for managing your time, your project, all of your materials, the things that you, the literature, your notes, and all the different pieces that you have. And I used to say to my students, one system is not necessarily better than another. Pick a system that you are comfortable with and stick with it, because, you know, you're going to have to build on this, you know, through this multi-stage process. In my own dissertation work at the time, I was like, I don't print everything out. I'm a digital person. I'm keeping all of my stuff electronic. Well, I reached a point where I just felt that I couldn't manage, you know, I needed to, you know, I ended up printing out a lot of my articles and putting them into binders by topic, because I found that I was overwhelmed trying to kind of multitask of having all of the, how many things could you have open on the screen and be writing at the same time? So it's not to say that you might not find, well, I've got a shortcoming in something that I tried and I need to move to something different, but try to set up those kinds of things like citation manager, file management system from the beginning. And if you're not somebody who those things come naturally to you, look at your university in the writing center, the teaching and learning center, or in the library, and see if they offer any kind of workshops or resources to help you kind of get started. Because if you just jump in, and which is many people's kind of intuitive approach to handling things, and thinking like, I'll figure it out as I go, like, just take our word for it. That's really probably not going to be, going to give you more frustration than it's worth.
You make a very important point there, Janet, and I totally agree with you that asking for help early and often is really important. And not just asking for help, I'd said seeking support. And the universities, writing centers, centers for teaching and learning, libraries, and your dissertation committee are all there to help support you as you move through this process. So I would really say that students should always reach out for support as needed. Be very proactive, be an advocate for yourself and ask for what you need so that you are supported throughout the process. And the other point I just want to comment on that you made, which is so important, is that there is no one right strategy for organizing. I know when I did my own dissertation, I really liked that physical storage of documentation, and many people do. So whatever works for you is the best approach to take to get the job done. And so, it's definitely the way to go in terms of like not seeing this as something that you're going alone. You are supported, and you do have community around you that are here to help and support.
Right. And that's, I mean, in a way, one of the unique aspects of being in a doctoral program versus, once you're out of school and you're managing other large projects, large research projects that may have reporting requirements, or perhaps writing a book, you're going to be involved with big multi-stage projects, throughout your academic career, if that's the direction you're going. So learning those skills and getting those systems into place and getting the help you need, taking advantage of the opportunity, within an academic institution as a student to get that kind of help. So we've talked about the organizational piece, which, as I say, can be the downfall of many doctoral students. But then there's the actual writing the thing, so even in the best case scenario, you're going to have multiple revisions of this kind of work, and the same thing, is at play when you're writing a book or other large writing projects later. But if you are short on some of the crucial writing skills, that process will be even more laborious. So, having, worked on this dissertation writing guide now into the 5th edition, what skills do you think that, new doctoral students should try to build up before they are faced with writing this large piece of work?
Thanks for that question. And I'm going to touch back on something we spoke about a few minutes ago, and that is seeking support. That is number one. Seeking support from your institution's writing center, academic success center, whatever is offered. Definitely engage in accessing those resources, attending sessions on writing, paragraph development, synthesis, academic writing skills in general, because most people are not naturally gifted with that at the start, but these are definitely skills that can be acquired and learned, and they really are important in producing a document at the level of a dissertation or thesis. So I would say right from the very beginning, see what support is offered at your institution and definitely access that. The other thing that is really important is that there are specific format and style requirements involved in any academic piece of work. And so whatever the format and style manual is that your institution or program adopts, usually it's APA, and APA is now in its 7th edition, you should become very familiar with the requirements and expectations of that format and style manual. And the APA edition is available online. There is a physical book on it, and most libraries, in fact, all libraries will carry it. There are also other format and style manuals, such as the Chicago and the, what is the other one, Janet? Help me, MLA.
There's MLA, Harvard.
Yeah. But those are less frequently used than APA. But whatever style is used by your institution, you will need to adopt. It's also really important to note that aside from format and style, APA for the first time in 2021 is systematically and institutionally examining, acknowledging, and charting a path forward to address inclusivity in writing. And the guidelines that they provide are written for those working to champion and advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the writing world. So definitely take a look at the APA 7 edition for the inclusivity guidelines so that all of the work that you write is considered inclusive and equitable. There are certain terminologies that are recommended, certain terms that are not recommended. And so it's really important to become familiar with these inclusive aspects of writing in addition to the general style and format. Also be really vigilant as you are setting off on your writing path to keep a list of all the references of everything that you read and update your references as soon as you add new ones. So that, again, similar to what I mentioned previously about an audit trail, you have a clear trail of all the references you need. And this will also help you when you come time to actually put your writing together in chapters so that you do not lose any references, because there is really nothing more frustrating than having a citation but not having an attached reference and then having to go back and see where you read that. And if you don't find it, you have to actually delete it. So I would say create your reference list as you develop each section. The reference list should be accurately alphabetized. The references must all be complete and accurate and not contain any missing or misspelled or incorrect details. Use your writing manual to format each reference correctly. If you're using citation software, ensure that all the information is included and properly formatted. And make sure that each reference for each reference that is listed, there is at least one corresponding citation. So just make sure that everything is very, very carefully organized. Again, that whole word organization comes through again in the aspect of writing, because if you're more organized in your mind and in your management skills, your writing will likely be more organized too. I also just want to say something about integrity and academic integrity in writing, because this is a really important part of academic writing, and that is that the strength of your writing rests on your ability to refer to and incorporate the work of others. But it's imperative that you attribute recognition to all and any sources of information that you use. And plagiarism, whether it's intended or unintended, is a serious offense in the academic world. So please be sure to also read up on how to properly reference your information, how to cite information, how to paraphrase, how to present quotations, etc. So those are really some of my biggest sort of recommendations regarding academic writing. And I think hopefully I've provided some that will really enable students to set off at the outset with knowledge about what is required in the process to be successful.
One of the things that I've always suggested, to my doctoral students was, look at the feedback you've gotten on your papers and your projects throughout your academic program. If you've gotten a lot of comments about organization or grammar or spelling or whatever, take care of those now. Use those as a springboard to go to your writing center, buy books about writing tactics, and get those straightened out, because you don't want to be dealing with those issues in the doctoral writing, because you're going to, you really want to be very comfortable and confident about those kinds of issues, about the big issues of structure and organization, and the smaller issues about sentence structure, grammar, and that sort of thing, because you want to be able to put your attention to the content of your message, not be distracted by those things, and also not to distract the people who are reviewing your work, because you really want them to give you comments about the content, not to be saying, why do you keep, you need subheadings, you need to, this, your stuff isn't formatted correctly. You don't want to waste your reviewers' time having to deal with those matters.
Yeah. You make a really important point there, Janet, that it really is also respectful to your reviewers to have everything correctly formatted, so that and so that you don't waste time, their time or your time, in doing clerical and editorial work. You can also use proofreaders, and that's another important point. Proofreaders are perfectly acceptable to review a document and to point out grammatical errors or typos, and formatting errors, and headings and subheadings and levels of headings, etc. So seek help for those things, but make sure that those are not the main concern of your reviewers, and that they're rather reviewing the content and giving you substantive feedback on the content, rather than on the formatting and style and spelling and grammar, etc.
So I want to move on as we kind of dig a little bit more deeply into parts of the dissertation. Another place where my students sometimes had some confusion was, as we get to kind of the later parts of a dissertation, once we've already conducted the study, we've collected the data, and we're in that more of the analysis and interpretation. So in your book, you break out findings, interpretations, and conclusions. And so I wondered if you could define each of those terms.
Sure. Yeah, in chapter 11 of my book, which is titled Drawing Trustworthy Conclusions and Presenting Actionable Recommendations, I again make the distinction between findings, interpretations, conclusions, and also recommendations. And the chart that will be posted on the Sage Method Space site is table 11.1, which is called my if, then, therefore, thus matrix, because this is how I explain the difference between findings, interpretations, and conclusions. The findings are, if I find this. So your findings are what your data actually tells you. This is what I have found. These are my themes. The interpretations is, then I think this. So the interpretation is actually going to a deeper level than the findings, and saying to yourself, well, now that I have found this, what do these findings really mean? So interpretation is the process of making deeper sense of what is going on in the data, why that may be significant, and what the implications might be. And that really is the act of meaning making of the data. And since the interpretation goes beyond the actual findings, which are the actual findings that you have established, the challenge is to make sure that your interpretations are credible and grounded in the data. So there's a lot of thinking work that goes into the interpretation. So the first part of that table would say, if I find this, which is the finding, then I think this, which is the interpretation. If we move to conclusions, the conclusion says, therefore I conclude that. So the conclusions are really the conclusive statements that you make based on your findings and your interpretation. So basically, knowing what I have found and what I think these findings mean, then I can conclude that. So your conclusions are tied to each finding. So basically, each finding could have one or more interpretations, and then also one or more conclusions. In generating those conclusions, you'll need to go back to your findings and your interpretations and say to yourself, I found this and I think it means this, and so I can now conclude this. So the conclusions are not just a restatement of the findings, but they represent a higher level of abstraction.
Mhm.
And just as the same as your conclusions are not the same as findings, the conclusions are also not the same as interpretations. So each of these are three different pieces of the puzzle, but they interconnect. And so understanding the difference among them is really important. And as I say, table 11.1 and also table 11.2, where I point out the consistency of the findings, interpretations, and conclusions. The consistency chart that will also be presented on the site, on the Sage Method Space site, shows how to actually check for alignment between your findings, interpretations, and conclusions for each of the different findings that you develop. So I think it's a really important question that you ask about the findings, interpretations, and conclusions, because it's really a matter of alignment and consistency, but also really understanding that each of these are very different, even though they're interconnected.
Right. And again, while your book is focused on qualitative, quantitative researchers, similarly have to discuss, well, so what does it mean? And this is where you need your own scholarly voice to come through, because you have to actually be able to make those interpretations and draw those conclusions and support them from your data and or from the literature. And this is where you might also be going back to the researcher journals and the notes that you mentioned, which again, some of these techniques that I know, qualitative researchers are more familiar with, I think are beneficial to any researcher to have, some way of kind of keeping record through the process.
Right, absolutely. And I think you point out something also really important, is that even though I may be speaking from a qualitative research point of view, which I often do, much of what we've discussed here today applies to any research project, be it qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, because the researcher ultimately has to make the decision about the interpretations and conclusions and recommendations. The findings speak for themselves. The findings are what the data presents us with. But we then have to take it a step further as a qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods researcher to actually make sense of those findings in a credible way. And that's where a lot of thinking work comes in, and a lot of organization and reflection.
Right. So just want to end by sharing with our viewers that the new edition of your book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a roadmap from beginning to end, is now available. And this book, truly does, provide a roadmap. And again, while it's focused on qualitative, certainly would be very useful to mixed methods researchers. And I think quantitative researchers might learn something about the dissertation process, even if the research component of the work is done using a different methodology. So is there anything you would like to share with us about what you've added to this new edition?
Yeah, one of the things that I added to the fourth edition, which was prior to this one, and which I think is still really important, is a chapter on alignment. And that goes back to alignment among all the different research components. But what I added to this new fifth edition, which I'm really excited about, is a brand new chapter on research ethics and rigor. And since COVID, a lot of new ethical considerations have come about in the way we do research, conduct research, write up research, etc. So I have a lot of information in this edition on researcher positionality, on establishing trustworthiness, on embracing ethical principles based on the Belmont report. So a lot of new information is included in this edition that was not in previous editions, in addition to many, many new tables and charts, and also a brand new student study site, which we call our online companion website, which is freely available through the book as well. And in that companion website are all the different charts and tables that are included in the book that can be downloaded for ease of use, as well as links to important resources and articles, my 101 questions about qualitative research, and just a lot of information that is really valuable, I think, to students in the in the dissertation process, whether they're right at the beginning of the process or already at some point in the process along the way.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience with not only writing 5 editions of this book, but you've walked the talk by working with doctoral students. And I think, as we've both shared, we learn a lot by seeing what obstacles students encounter. So we hope that what we've shared here today will be useful.
Thanks so much, Janet. I really appreciate all of your time spent on educating students on the research process and on all the different resources that Sage Method Space offers. I always recommend my students to look at the site and to look at all the resources, and they find it so useful. So, as always, I appreciate your time and your enthusiasm and your passion for research. Thank you so much.
Well, let's hope that our viewers will bring that kind of enthusiasm to their work, because we certainly need disciplined, thoughtful researchers to develop new understandings and new findings that will, help us to understand the complicated problems in our world today.
Well, I just want to say one last thing in closing. And again, just to touch on what you've just said, the afterword of my book is really focused on the importance and value of research in today's world and the changes that we can bring about as a result of our research, and the important complex social and cultural problems that we face in the world today that deserve deeper understanding. And so my hope is that with the research that is conducted by doctoral students and postdoctoral students will continue in a critical vein to try and better understand a lot of the complications of society and of the world at large, and that we can be proud of the work that we do because it does bring about real change.
Agreed. Thank you.